Hey everybody, welcome to the Fired Up with CJ show. Today we're talking to W. Keith Campbell, who is a professor at psychology at the University of Georgia and the author of the book, The New Science of Narcissism, Understanding One of the Greatest Psychological Challenges of Our Time and What You Can Do About It. It is one of the greatest psychological challenges of our times.
Yeah.
That's the laughing. You can find him at wkeithcampbell.com. So welcome, Keith.
Oh, thanks for having me, CJ.
Okay, I want to get to the basics first by starting narcissism and what is it, and just kind of break it down for us in practical terms.
Sure. So narcissism is a term we use a lot without really knowing what it is, but usually it's sort of, somebody who's arrogant, a little self-centered. And when we talk about it in psychology, in the research world, we're talking about a personality trait, meaning this is something some people are high in narcissism, some are low on narcissism, but most of us have some narcissism in us, some ego in us. And when we define it, we have two different definitions of narcissism. One is this more grandiose form of narcissism, which is somebody who's sort of, self-centered, but maybe extroverted, arrogant, cocky, maybe likable when you first meet them and charming sometimes. So it's this more energized form of narcissism. And this is what we see when we date or when we elect politicians, or these are the people we work for often, the more kind of diva-like narcissist form. And then there's this other form, which is, you've got this combination of the self-centeredness, but there's some insecurity there, some fragility. So it's people who are, I'm really special, but the world doesn't quite recognize that about me. It makes me a little insecure. I don't know how to get the attention I need. And, sometimes there's fantasies about greatness, but there's not really the efforts to be great as much. And this is a form of narcissism we talk about as more vulnerable narcissism.
Okay.
And there's lots of names for these two terms. So it might be vulnerable or shy or hidden or covert or closet or basement. But it's this sort of more reserved form of narcissism that's much harder to see in people.
Mm.
And then the grandiose form is more, exhibitionistic and spoiled and in your face and out in the open. And it's this much more kind of seeable form of narcissism. And we talk about both of these as narcissism, and we get mixed up a lot. And sometimes people say that, well, these people who are really grandiose, deep down, they're really vulnerable. So
Mm.
no way somebody's that confident. They must be deep down, they must be kind of weak and shallow and insecure. And that's why they're acting so brave and confident and
Mm.
trying to get attention. And so that's how people kind of made sense of these two forms of
Mm.
narcissism. They said, really, it's just one form. But
Mm.
that doesn't seem to be the case. It
Mm.
seems that these are really two different forms of ego that we see. We call both narcissism, but they're a little bit different.
Yeah, so I find a whole bunch of things that are new to me. One is that it's actually ego, which is our aspect of, and can you define on a psychological term what that means? Because I have a spiritual meaning of it.
Yes, and I can, but it's very hard. So
Okay.
sometimes we talk about this entire structure of the self. It's how I think about myself. It's how I act. It's how I control my behavior. Maybe how I get attention. How I form relationships. How I gain and lose weight. All those things have to do with this broad thing we call the self, or we call the ego. The term ego was brought in because back in the day, Freud called it the I in German, and that didn't sound interesting enough. So they said, well, let's call it ego because that's the Latin term. It sounds more sophisticated. But really, the term Freud used was the I, just the I, the
Mm-hmm.
person.
Mm-hmm.
And so we use this term ego to mean this whole bag of tricks that we kind of take us through life, how we see ourselves and how we regulate ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing with ego is that it becomes very involved in what we do. So our relationships, when we think, well, these should be about love, are also about ego. They're about getting attention. They're about getting our needs met. They're about finding an attractive
Mm.
spouse so I'm popular at parties,
Mm-hmm.
about finding somebody to take care of me and tell me I'm awesome. So ego kind of sneaks into a lot of things
Mm.
in life.
Mm.
Spiritually, it's sort of that bigger question of sort of this ego versus something much bigger than that. And that's where it
Right.
gets beyond psychology into this more spiritual realm. And
Right. So, but in the psychological realm, it's how you gain attention, how you relate to others to actually gain
yeah,
attention.
it's so imagine I see myself as a seven in life. I want to be a seven, but really I'm a five.
Mm-hmm.
And so that gap between a five and a seven is something my ego can fill up. I'm like, well,
Mm.
I'm not that attractive, but if I get these really attractive new shoes, that'll make me more attractive. And, I don't really like myself, but if I surround myself with people that say, Keith, you're awesome all the time, I'm going to like myself a little more. And, maybe I don't feel that good about myself, but if I buy this new car, I'll feel good about myself. So I use all these things in my life to
Mm.
kind of build up this model of who I am. And if I do this well, it can be a really pretty model, and I can show people how special and unique and cool I am. But it takes a lot of effort.
Right, so all of us have needs, and all of us want to actually have others help fulfill our needs. So to the extent that we have them, then what was new for me is that we rely on a continuum of like how,
Yes.
so to say that I'm not narcissist, you're a narcissist. So it's like, it's kind of like we all are because we all have egos, so therefore so that was interesting. And then also that
Mm.
there's this grandiose, which I think most of us view as like the typical, but there's
Yes.
this vulnerable kind, which is kind of more shy and covert, but they also
Yes.
have a sense of what does it show it like in the, you said they're vulnerable, shy, covert, but what would it show up with? How would I be able to know whether I'm a shy,
Well,
introverted narcissist?
it's interesting is that grandiosity will often show up in fantasy. So you
Mm,
imagine you're kind of living this life that isn't as great as you want, but you fantasize about, being respected, being on the television, having, attractive people like you, want to have relationships with you. And sometimes, people go from this more vulnerable form to an active form. So we see these
mm,
crimes committed by people that sometimes they call incel crimes. But somebody who's really vulnerable that says, I'm going to go out and establish my dominance by going out and shooting somebody.
mm,
So that's an example where something that is a fantasy about dominance, a fantasy about being an alpha male is, one of the examples we give in the book. That fantasy can become reality when someone goes out and commits a crime or does something, really outside of the fantasy world. So they can break from fantasy to reality. The movie The Joker, is a movie about
yes.
somebody who's a really vulnerable narcissist who has a lot of this grandiosity, and then he becomes a real character in the movie. It's because it's a movie. There's an
Ah,
arc where he becomes
I see. So, as I recall it, which is a fantastic and terrifying movie,
yes,
he's like very shy and he has these visions of like some girl having a crush on him, but it's like it's not even a reality, and he's like creating fantasies. So, it's the fantasy aspect of it. It could come in an imagination kind of form, or it could come in like it actually is manifesting in reality. But regardless, yeah.
exactly,
Okay, got it.
exactly. So yeah, so the challenge is these fantasies can become realities sometimes.
Yeah. And so, you in the book you talk about narcissistic personality disorder versus narcissism. Is that the thing that we're talking about?
Well, that brings in sort of the third definition of narcissism. So when we talk, I'm a social personality psychologist. I study normal people for the most part, but with a lot of these normal personality traits, when our personality becomes really extreme and we can't control it, when we become so narcissistic, we can't turn it off. We've always got to be getting attention. We always have to, you
Mm,
know, get our needs met. We can't ever be slighted and let people get away with it. when it becomes that extreme that it starts damaging our life, it hurts our relationships because our marriages fall apart, it hurts our work because we can't work with people, it can be diagnosed as a disorder, which is called
Mm,
Narcissistic Personality Disorder, or NPD.
mm.
And so this disorder is relatively rare. 1 to 2% of the population might be diagnosed with it at any one time. But it's a disorder of extreme narcissism. And to make it a little more confusing, the definition of the disorder contains both grandiosity and vulnerability. It's about 2/3 grandiose, 1/3 vulnerable. But
Mm.
both those, so when you see these really extreme forms of narcissism, you see grandiosity, but you often will see some vulnerability in there as well.
Okay, God. But you had said before you could actually be a grandiose with no vulnerability, or is
You can be for sure, and you can be vulnerable with no grandiosity, or you can have a combination. And when they define the clinical disorder, and they have a diagnostic manual, the DSM-5, where they do this, they include both aspects of grandiosity and vulnerability in there.
wow,
So it's
interesting.
somebody who is admiration and attention seeking, likes to hang out with famous and high status people, lacks empathy, has a need for grandiosity, is envious or thinks people are envious of him or her, and also has their self-esteem go up and down
Right.
occasionally. So it's this weird
Wow,
mix.
fascinating.
Yeah, so part of the confusion is people will say, you're narcissistic or you're a narcissist, but they mean it as a trait, or they might mean that as a clinical term, like you're suffering from narcissistic personality
Right.
disorder. But it's the same thing with depression. If somebody says, I'm depressed. Hey, CJ, I'm depressed. That doesn't mean necessarily, well, I'm suffering from major depressive disorder, I need some serious treatment. It means, I'm depressed.
Right.
But because we have a clinical language that mirrors a normal language, we use the same
Right.
term for two things if we're not
Right.
specific about it.
Yeah, and it's very unclear. And I think generally when someone says, "Oh, you're a narcissist," it's not like that's your personality trait. It's usually as a dig on how that person is
Yes.
vain and like not available for other people or not relating them to any way. But this is just so interesting to hear all the dimensionalities of it. We've been
Yes.
talking to W. Keith Campbell, who's a professor of psychology at the University of Georgia, about his book, The New Science of Narcissism. Thank you so much.
Thank
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. I would love your support in any way by giving me comments below or to subscribe to the show or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.